Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, or maybe good evening. Anyway, welcome everybody. My name is Yves Goudineau. I am an anthropologist, professor at the EFEO, the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, French School for Asian Studies. And I have the honor to start and in a way to chair this session today of our seminar, Comparative Anthropology of Southeast Asia. Before briefly tracing the history of this seminar, I would like first to introduce my three colleagues around this table. So first, Vanina Bouté. Vanina Bouté is a social anthropologist, professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, EHESS here. And she's director of the Centre d'Asie du Sud-Est, Center for Southeast Asian Research. And has been director since 2018. After several years of fieldwork in North Laos, Vanina completed a PhD in social anthropology at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris in 2005, and she lectured on the anthropology of Southeast Asia at the University of Aix-Marseille, then was associate professor at the University of Picardy. And so she recently joined the EHESS here. Among Vanina's publications, I would particularly mention her book, En miroir du pouvoir, Les Punoi du Nord Laos, translated into English, Mirroring Power, which concentrates on the social changes among the Punoi, a Highlander border guard group in northern Laos, from the colonial context to the post-colonial period. Vanina's current research is focused on migration and dynamic of change among Highlanders living at the Lao-Chinese border. So then Catherine Scheer. Catherine Scheer is also an anthropologist at the EFEO, so the French School of Asian Studies. She obtained a PhD from the EHESS here in 2014. After a postdoctoral fellowship at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore, she joined the Institute for Anthropology at the University of Heidelberg as a lecturer. Catherine has done extended field research in Cambodia Northeast, close to the Vietnam border, with Bunong Highland dwellers who have been navigating through intense environmental and socio-economical transformation. She paid particular attention to dynamics of Christianization that led her to be attentive to oral history. More recently, she followed Protestant language experts across international institutions in Southeast Asia. Her interest is in the intersection of Christianity, development, politics of recognition, and indigeneity, reflected in her publication, which include a volume edited with Michael Finner and Philippe Fontaine on the mission of development, religion, and technopolitics in Asia, and also an article titled Guardians of the Forest or Evil Spirits, Unsettling Politicized Ontologies in the Cambodian Islands. And last but not least, Andrew Hardy. So Andrew is a regular guest at this seminar and actively participates in the dialogue that we wish to establish between the anthropologists, that we are mainly, and historians of Southeast Asia. So Andrew Hardy, who is also professor at the EFEO, French School of Asian Studies, is a historian of Vietnam with research interest in migration and ethnic relations and a geographical focus on the central region of Vietnam. Andrew first studied at the University of Cambridge, then came to France to follow courses on the history of Vietnam at the University Paris 7, so Paris Diderot now. And he defended a PhD at the Australian National University under the supervision of David Moore. His doctoral thesis focused on the relationships between migrants and the state in Vietnamese lowland-upland migration. It was published in a book entitled Red Hills, which has become a major reference in Vietnamese and Southeast Asian studies. Since joining the EFEO in 2002, his research has focused on Vietnamese expansion to the south, and the relations between the extinct kingdom of Champa and Vietnam. His research on the history of central Vietnam has also led him to study the Long Wall of Quang Ngai, allowing him to conduct multidisciplinary research on the relation between the Viet and the three ethnic minorities from 18th century to 20th century, about which he will tell us more. So before giving the floor to the speakers, I would like to say a word about the history of this seminar, and above all to recall the place of Southeast Asian studies at the EHESS. Actually, several eminent researchers have indeed been the basis of the studies here, and I would like to quickly recall their name and their work, of which were largely the heirs and, I would say, principal beneficiaries. I would also like to remind you that they were the founders of research centers on Southeast Asia attached to the CNRS, so the French National Center for Scientific Research, and to the EHESS. So I'll try to show. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Yes. And as you can see now on the slide, so actually there were two very big centers, one devoted to, I would say, peninsular Southeast Asia, which was the Cédracénie, so which was created by Georges Condominas, André Georges Audricourt, and Lucien Bernot, and another center created by Denis Lombard, historian, called Archipel. And after, I would say, successive mergers, the center became now the CAS, Centre Asie du Sud-Est, which is actually the larger and the main center on Southeast Asian studies in France now. So just to go, voilà. Just to go back to, I would say, the ancestors of this seminar, famous ancestors of this seminar. First, I will recall that Georges Condominas, so used to teach in this the EHESS in this institution since he has been teaching since 1960, and he died in 2011, and so he gave a seminar here until the age of 84, and here you can see his main publications. So some are very famous. We have Eaten the Forest, and also Social Space, l'espace social. And I would say that Georges Condominas was a renowned international scholar, and he was also extremely famous in Vietnam. And you had exhibitions and many celebrations for Georges Condominas in Hanoi. Also, I would like to mention André Georges Audricourt and Lucien Bernot. So they're not as well known as Condominas was, but André Georges Audricourt was really a very important scholar, working in ethno-linguistics, so in Southeast Asia, but also in ethnobotanic, and he was also very interested by technology. And he wrote fundamental articles about technology among people of Southeast Asia. Another one is Lucien Bernot. So Lucien Bernot was a specialist of Burma, and he worked mostly in Arakan, and he used to teach also here at the EHESS. So also Denis Lombard. So Denis Lombard was not an anthropologist, he was a historian, but he was a very famous historian of Indonesia, and his book, unfortunately not translated in English, Le Carrefour Javanais, in 3 volumes, is I would say it's really a sum of research about Javanese crossroads. So he was considering, I would say, in the tradition of Brodel, you know, the Asian Mediterranean as a space of trade and exchanges, so between the archipelago and the peninsular Southeast Asia. Just to go back to, I would say, to the roots of this seminar, I would say that I would just recall that so Georges Condé held a seminar here. The title was Ethnology and Sociology of Southeast Asia and the Austronesian World, actually in Monde Insulindien, that means insular Southeast Asia, but difficult to translate in English. And the main topic of a seminar was around the notion of social space. And he studied, I would say, what he called restricted social space, like small ethnic groups, and also intermediate social space. That means that some tribes or some big groups that had not the status of state, but which are a very sophisticated social organization, like the black tie or the white tie in Vietnam, supposed to be a sort of feudal pre-state, and he called that intermediate social space. And so he proposed some very interesting, I would say, new trails of research in this field. Also, he worked on slavery, on the relationship of societies to their environments, and he had a special interest in ethnoscience, so especially ethnobotany, where he worked also with André-Georges Audricourt. So his seminar was a great success. So it was held in years when Southeast Asia was in the middle of the Vietnam War, and many, I would say, international scholars came to Paris to follow his seminar, including some colleagues from Southeast Asia, from Cambodia or from Vietnam. So from 2005, Georges Condé asked me to take over his seminar. So he was, I say, he was 84 years old, and so he asked me to go on with the seminar, and so that's when I started actually this seminar that we have today. So just before giving the floor to Vanina, just a word about this seminar. So the current seminar, in a way, was a continuation of another ones that I was giving at the EHESS, and which was mostly devoted to continental Southeast Asia. And I was interested by peninsular Southeast Asia as a comparative space, and I have a special interest on Austroasiatic societies, knowing that so I did field work for almost 7 years in the Anamities chain. The Annamese cordillera between the South Laos and central Vietnam, among Catholic societies, of Austroasiatic societies. So, so we started the seminar here in 2000 at the EHESS, and I would say that well, it's difficult to sum up, 15 years, 17 years, even of seminar, but just I would say that the main topics and issues that we're studying were articulating an anthropology of religions and political anthropology, and with a strong interest in local cults and the way they were subject to political control by different states. So the question of comparatism was at the heart of the seminar. And actually, we saw when we studied especially some sacrificial rituals, that Southeast Asia was an artificial, I would say, region. That we could see that we were studying rituals that were expanding outside the borders of Southeast Asia. So in 2014, we proposed to have another one, which was comparative anthropology from Southeast Asia. And we did this seminar with colleagues working in South China and in eastern or southern India. And it was interesting to see that the comparison was revealing the belonging to sometimes some cultural system of societies that were a priori very distant. So we try to understand that, and so I cannot go into details, but we try to think of how to explain, the similarity of rituals between societies, sometimes 3,000 kilometers distant, and we refuse to use, I would say, pure diffusionism, and so we had recourse to cognitive anthropology to try to explain cultural transmission of traditions. Okay, so maybe I will stop here, and just a word to say that so I conducted this seminar for many years, but with some colleagues from other institutions, with Bénédicte Braque de la Perrière, she's a specialist of Burma, with Denis Vidal, who is a specialist of India, with Beatrice David, she's a specialist of South China, and more recently with Vanina Bouté. So she's been with me for the last 7 years, I would say, and Catherine Scheer, so joined us more recently. And I think now it's my pleasure to give them the floor, and I'm sorry, I've not been too long.
Okay, thank you, Yves. So maybe I will explain now what is the topic of our seminar. Our purpose is to provide an opportunity to think and reflect on Southeast Asia as a field of inquiry. And this is thus a part of the more general problematic of area studies conducted here at EHESS, especially with the forthcoming international conference on this theme to be held next November. Now, as you see in this slide, Southeast Asia as a region is a relatively new idea and has been maybe more than any other area studies, more difficult to define because of its geographical fragmentation, its division into 10 nation states, and the diversity of languages that are spoken there. And one of the objectives of this seminar is to show the complexity of this area through different case studies, but around common objects and issues, which try to deconstruct at the same time, the current borders of nation states. Borders, you can see on another slide, that can restrict a broader vision. For example, take just one example, when a student begins a country-based research project, he or she will tend to consider and read only what concerns this country and the research produced on this or that topic or population inside the country. As anthropologists, our objective is obviously comparison. But these comparisons, which may concern objects, theories, and so on, must also involve the comparison of ethnographies. And for us, it's the only way that we can also focus, and thanks to diversity, what makes the unity of the area studies that interest us, Southeast Asia. Donc, Southeast Asia should be historically defined as regional constructs that expand and acquire more substance over time. Now, it starts, as historian Anthony Reid argued, in a bottom-up manner. It was the local communities of peasants and fishermen living in small-scale communities that formed the common backbone of the region. And this reality did not disappear with the events of the colonial states and then even the wars, which created and continued in a certain way, common experiences within the states or between those administered by the same power, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, for example. And this experience continues today with the integration into ASEAN, and also several countries and their populations can experience today similar geopolitics events. For instance, the push of China to its southern borders and the importance taken in this context of the land issues, for example. For these reasons, it's also this construction of Southeast Asia as an area of studies that we are interested in, and by bringing history and anthropology into dialogue. So here I will discuss two things. Why the question of comparatism is important to be undertaken for Southeast Asia. And second, what is the scientific proposition of the seminar? And then here we will come back to anthropology and history. Alors, as Yves Goudineau mentioned, the question of comparatism was from the outset at the heart of the seminar's project. And by doing so, we choose to consider an area wider than those usually considered in the divisions into area studies, which distinguish Southeast Asian studies, in the Indian world, Chinese world, the Himalayan area, and so on. In continental Southeast Asia, however, such a perspective was opened up in the 50s by the famous work of Edmund Lynch on the Kachin of Burma. Now, let me recall that Lynch has shown that Kachin social dynamics had evolved, adopting a model of hierarchical social structures in contact with lowland populations. And in the following decades, this approach was debated, notably by Frederick Lehman, you can see a picture of this book, investigating among the Chin, or by Thomas Kirsch, with a comparative regional focus. But their perspective was little followed, thus missing the development of a real theoretical field on the highland societies of the region. The question of the comparative approach was reopened in 2002 by geographer Willem van Schendel, but on a wider area, on the scale of Asia. He argued for the need to approach Asian mountain societies together, and then distinguishes a new area at the crossroad, as you can see, of the cultural areas traditionally recognized by researchers, so different politically and historically. This world, as you can see, extends from the western foothills of the Himalayas to the Tibetan plateaus and up to the highlands of continental Southeast Asia. Van Schendel chose to name this area Zomia, from a term meaning mountain people in one of the Tibeto-Burmese languages of the region. For Van Schendel, the main characteristic political of this zone will be to gather societies living at the marches of states or dominant society of the plains, with which they would maintain antagonistic relations. However, Van Schendel recognizes that this is a heuristic concept more likely to develop a new field of questions and methods than a real object of study. And he has quickly left these questions aside and did not initiate any collective research that will have support his demonstration. Van Schendel's proposal went relatively unnoticed until it was taken up by the anthropologist Jean Michaud. Now, Jean Michaud, who will be here, by the way, in May as visiting professor invited by the EHESS. In his book, historical dictionary of the peoples of the Southeast Asian Massif, Jean-Michel chooses to replace the term Zomia with Southeast Asian Massif. Under this name, he groups together the highlands, defined as including all the land located above 500 meters in altitude of continental Southeast Asia, but also, as you can see, of southern China. Then, after the publication of James Scott's book, I will come back to this later, Jean-Michel, in an introduction to a special issue of the Journal of Global History entitled Zomia and Beyond, a challenge to area studies in global history, excludes the mountainous area of Nepal, Bhutan, and India. So, as you see, all the orange part on the map, as well as part of the provinces of China. Michaud condemns researchers that study each local society only in relation to the nation state in which it's included. But his defense of the use of the Zomia concept, or Southeast Asian Massif, tended to be limited to a plea for the study of the same ethnic group on both sides of national borders. At least that's what the article in this special issue proposed. The idea of putting in perspective different populations located within the same national space or beyond was not evoked. Then Van Schendel's proposal was also taken up by political scientist James Scott in his book, The Art of Not Being Governed, but an anarchist history of upland Southeast Asia, which has enjoyed a success in recent years, success well beyond the circle of scholars of the region. Also, I will do it briefly. Yes, it's a good image. Scott considers the consistency of the area as being born of a dialectical relationship between two types of populations in the course of history. On the one hand, the state-based population of the lowlands with predatory hymns, and on the other hand, the mountain peoples, the latter being deliberately marginal and deterritorializing themselves constantly in order to escape the process of statization. And Scott assumes that there's a general dynamic at work in the relationships between highlanders and lowlanders over a very wide geographic area in Asia. It will be marked by a fundamental antagonism. The highlanders of the Southeast Asian Massif will not only represent societies against the state, comparable in this respect to the Amazonian societies, according to Pierre Clastre, but the entire history will show that they were constituted and involved with the perspective of being the state. The problem is this vision is following on from a large part of the scientific literature devoted to the population of Southeast Asia, maintaining the image of an essential and persistent opposition between population of the plain and valleys, periods of civilization, and highland peoples, tribes, ethnic minorities who have remained on the margins. So this idea of a great divide, as you can see, is based on crude geographical determinism that has given rise to a disciplinary division of tasks. Historians, archaeologists, epigraphers are to study the former, anthropologists the later. Which regard to continental Southeast Asia, this supposedly fundamental opposition subdivides into several others. I miss one. opposition of political system, demographic opposition, religious opposition, can you tell us more, and agricultural opposition, for instance, between paddy field cultivators and slash-and-burn rice farmers. In every case, this binary simplification, which only applies in a very general way, for the most part obliterates regional historical dynamics along with contemporary local realities. So it's a good image. Various criticism and objections have been made to this book, whose author has never hidden the fact that he wanted it to be debated. One of the criticisms of particular interest for us, you will see why, that has been leveled at Scott, notably by historian Christian Daniels, is that Scott makes hasty generalization based on a narrow historical knowledge issue based. So, as you can see, I quote, while purporting to narrate history, Scott fails to document the chronological changes that took place in the societies of individual of multiple upland ethnic groups. In other words, there is remarkably little history, unquote. Also, historians have succeeded in sequencing the history of the main kingdoms of the region based on the various royal chronicles, for instance. They have been able to tell us almost nothing about the social life of the population that made them up. And here I remind you of what the anthropologist Georges Condominos wrote in the 80s, whether from Chinese historical records or Thai epigraphic texts, or even the Nitan and Ong-Savadan, chronicles and annals in Pali and in Northern Thai. The essential character of their sources has imposed on historians' research, which essentially traces factual history, determination of place and dates, establishment of the sequence of dynasties, biographies of kings, and so on. People, however, are hardly mentioned, unquote. As for anthropologists, who, in spite of themselves, lend support to Scott's argument, they have most often concentrated on societies that have remained on the margins and are supposed to have resisted any form of integration. So in this seminar, Comparative Anthropology of Southeast Asia, we have chosen the theme Ethnicity and Historical Dynamics of Integration in Southeast Asia. Based on the comparative analysis of detailed ethnographies, we propose to go beyond this dichotomized and overly reduced vision, and our work is based on phenomena of interaction, interdependence, and even mutual appropriation between centers and margins in the recent history of Southeast Asia. Okay, indeed, a number of works provides another view of the relationship between mountain minorities and lowland majorities. And these approaches showed the part of the mountain people in the making of lowland societies. A crucial study if we ever want to have a complete vision of the history of Southeast Asia. So by working on local sources, they made it possible to understand in detail the process of development of certain small or medium-sized centralities enlarged by the progressive absorption of the internal margins. Alors for historians, for instance, Charles Archambault, Le Sacrifice du Bœuf, but also the work of Volker Grabowski, Goudineau Chassin, and for anthropologists, the work of Andrew Tanton, and also Armstrong Johnson, and my own work, since this is the position I have adopted for the last 10 years. So through an ethno-historical approach, I discussed the creation over the course of nearly a century of a group that is now considered as an ethnic minority within the Lao nation state, the Punai. I have shown that the ethnic identity of the Punai emerged as a result of the interaction of groups initially defined as bodyguards with powerful political centers. So my research shows that many other mountain minorities must be seen as internal margins, liable to various forms of autonomy within the orbit of state formations with which they have long practiced various types of transaction. This does not exclude participation, regional transaction on network, commercial, intercultural, and so on, and other forms of exchange with neighboring ethnic minorities. Okay, come back, please. From my experiences, studies conducted from this perspective in the north of continental Southeast Asia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, confirm the relevance of such comparatism and the interest and the need of modernity. So, to remain at the margins as a deliberate action is therefore the exception. The structuring principle in most of these societies is, on the contrary, the result of privileged interaction with at least one other society, which may involve the borrowing of some of its cultural characteristics. So, in this seminar, we have been proposing for the past 2 years a comparative work of historical ethnography with a regional scope that is in line with this issue of internal margins. We then focuses on the several modes of integration or autonomy. And also, rather than postulating a general thesis that crushes the data, our aim is to understand for each society under consideration its position in relation to neighboring country, whether dominant or not, in all its ethnographic and historical complexity. And in conclusion, how do we work in the seminar? So there's an initial session which recalls the main anthropological issues arising from the debate on ethnicity in Southeast Asia, introducing some of the classic texts that were then discussed within the seminar. The subject of several sessions is then the analysis of discourses related to the historical dynamics of ethnicity, often differentiated or sometimes opposed according to the local cultures or national histories considered. A guiding thread for several presentations is the need to take into account the history of the margins at the regional level. Of course, a term that requires definition and contextualization in each case, in order to understand the formation of kingdoms, both continental and insular. Then the seminar is organized in 9 sessions of 3 hours each, twice a month. The first 2 hours are devoted to the presentation of ethnographic materials and original archives on the above mentioned topics by researchers, specialists on these themes. The third hour is reserved for the reading of a classical anthropological or historical text on Southeast Asia, texts by Leach, Archambault, Lehmann, Condominas, and so on, chosen for its particular approach linking anthropology and history, and which may echo the previous presentation. Each text is also introduced by a student and then discussed collectively. The idea is to build a common culture of text around the seminar's reflection, and also to bring the students to make links with the topic they deal with in their own research, whatever the area studies considered. For example, this year we have a lot of students registered working on France and Europe, and who are happy to make links with their own research on the banlieue française, for instance, as we have last week. So I finish here and let my two colleagues give a view of their work on this relation between Southeast Asian Highlanders and the Central Powers. First, Catherine Scheer, co-organizer of the seminar and anthropologist, and then Andrew Hardy, historian, and as we recalled, one of the participants of the seminar.
2 years ago, I had the pleasure of joining Vanina, Bouté, Yves, Goudineau, and at that time Batana Portela for this seminar, which I used to attend and enjoy as a student. As Yves mentioned, my research has been largely focused on the transformations induced by Christianization dynamics among Cambodian highland inhabitants. Thus, I propose to approach the relations between Southeast Asia's highlanders and the Central Powers through the lens of Christianization, in particular in its Protestant form. Protestant missionaries present in the region, especially from the 19th century onwards, were relatively successful with the so-called animist populations of the uplands compared to the unreceptiveness of most majority populations. In majority Buddhist Burma, for instance, the American Baptist mission started in 1813 to be in contact with Karen people, many of whom converted to Christianity over the following decades. Anthropologist Yoko Hayami underlined the key role that the first Karen convert played in this process by traveling extensively across the region, facilitating the conversion of more than 1,200 people. You can still stay there before moving to the highlands. So people have the time to give it a look. By the early 20th century, Protestant evangelical missionaries focused their attention even more intensely on remote highland areas, as they considered that the gospel must be brought to all the peoples of the world in their mother tongue. The missions tended to have more freedom of action in places that were governed by colonizers themselves from Protestant societies. In predominantly Muslim Indonesia, missionaries from the Salvation Army started to preach to the Tobacco Highlanders of central Sulawesi shortly after the island had become effectively controlled by the Dutch in 1905. They were followed by numerous other missionary organizations, and according to Lorraine Aragon, by 1980, the island's highland inhabitants belonged to one Protestant group or another. These Highlanders' adoption of Christianity came to be more systematically analyzed by anthropologists at the end of the 1980s and during the 1990s. For instance, the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies published a series of papers that had been presented at a symposium on Protestants and tradition in Southeast Asia. One thing these stimulating early analyses have in common is that they pay considerable attention to how the relationship between the Central Powers and Highland peoples influenced the latter's adoption of Christianity. A prevalent interpretation of Highland minorities' conversion in the Buddhist or Muslim majority countries of the region presented it as a way to, on one hand, bend to the Central Powers' pressure to modernize and integrate the nation state by adopting a valorized world religion that differed from their often depreciated spirit practices, but at the same time to maintain difference by opting for a religion that is not that of the majority group. Among the first to have phrased things this way was Nicholas Tapp, who wrote with regard to the Hmong in Thailand that, I quote, Christianity appears to offer an alternative way of remaining Hmong without being absorbed by the Thai state through gaining an identity of higher order and thus avoiding the more mundane choice between mere continuation of an ethnic minority status and total assimilation. End of quote. Similarly, Anne Cornelia Camara wrote with reference to Thailand's Aka that by, I quote, converting to Protestantism, they will not become second-rate Buddhists. And Lorraine Aragon considered that the tobacco of central Sulawesi, who affiliated with the Protestant Church, emphasized their ethnic difference and connected to powerful Western nations to, quote her, counterbalance their minority self-image as technically backward mountain farmers. There were, however, already at that stage, anthropologists who tempered the interpretation of conversion to Christianity as being an ethnic statement. For instance, Yoko Hayami, who noted the openness of the Karen living in northern Thailand to a diversity of religious practices, including Buddhism, as well as the complexity of factors involved in people's choice to follow one religion rather than another one. Observations like Hayami's, however, did not do much to undermine the idea that for most peripheral peoples, conversion to Christianity was a way to maintain their distinct ethnic identity. This idea was more distinctly challenged a decade later in Oscar Saleming's provocatively titled paper, "Is Protestant Conversion a Form of Protest?" ? Saleming notes that contrary to what he and others thought, the claim of, and I quote him, the claim of religious profiling of ethnic difference is certainly not universally applicable in Southeast Asia. In his early analyses of the adoption of Christianity among the inhabitants of Vietnam's Central Highlands, Saleming had described conversion as a way for people to express their own distinct identity after the defeat of their ethno-nationalist movement. However, he later came to emphasize the need to broaden the scope and argued that Protestant conversion could also connect people to the networks of the market and the state. This emphasis is even more important with regard to the contemporary context, which sees a diversification of types and shapes of missionary work. What I would like to suggest here is not only to be cautious when mobilizing factors that were probably relevant in certain conversion situations, but that are not always prevailing, but it is also to invert the approach. That is, rather than reading conversion through the lens of the relations between Highland groups and the state, I propose to reflect upon these very relations through an analysis of Christianization dynamics. Conversion to Christianity is a complex process that anthropologists have been exploring in more consequent ways over the past 2 decades. I argue that by studying Christianization in depth, new light might be shed on Highland perceptions of the state and its dominant culture. To support this point, I will provide an example from my research in Cambodia, which concerns a relatively recent and extremely turbulent period, that is the time between the post-independence government and the takeover of the murderous Khmer Rouge regime. Still little is known about the ways in which the inhabitants of the Cambodian highlands dealt with the integration politics implemented after the country became independent from France in 1953, and throughout the years of conflict that started in the 1960s with the spillover of Vietnam War. In Cambodia, the mountain-dwelling minority groups only make up a very small part of, that's today estimated at around 2 or even less than 2% of the national population, which is in majority Khmer. Most of the highland minorities live in the country's northeast, bordering Vietnam and Laos. Over the last 2 decades, historians have shed light on various assimilation politics that aimed to develop the fertile highlands and to turn its inhabitants into proper Khmer, notably through the promotion of Buddhism. However, it was only over the past couple of years that anthropologists started to provide further insights into the ways in which Highlanders dealt with and were affected by these politics. Research in the northeasternmost province of Ratanakiri by Ian Bird, Jonathan Padway, and I also take this opportunity to say that Jonathan Padway will also be with us in just a few weeks as a visiting professor at EHESS, and also Frédéric Bourdier, who not only described the violence that was underlying government politics, but also hinted at popular resentment and its consequences. For instance, it became clear that the Cambodian military's violent repressions of Highlanders who had manifested their discontent about being forcefully displaced from their lands to make space for a large state rubber plantation had greatly benefited the Vietnamese and Khmer rebels who were hiding in the surrounding forests. It was not rare for Highlanders during the 60s to join the communist forces, even though they would soon become aware of the Khmer Rouge's brutality and partly try to escape it. Yet we still know less about the ways in which the mostly Bunong inhabitants of Mondulkiri province experienced this period. In the course of my research, it became clear that many of those Bunong living close to the Vietnamese border escaped in the early 1970s to South Vietnam. These flights were clearly due to American bombings of their homelands to reach the Ho Chi Minh Trail's mandate. However, what might appear somewhat surprising is that at least several hundred Bunong refugees chose to go back to Cambodia and join the National Army of the newly established Khmer Republic in their fight against communists. There is little evidence of this mission. I found barely any written traces, and most of the people who went through the fight to join this fight never returned. The way I even came to know about this peculiar war involvement was through a conversion story, told by two of the very few Bunong who had managed to survive and return. It was when this elderly couple of Bunong farmers told me that they turned to Christianity in Phnom Penh in the early 1970s that, surprised, I started to inquire more deeply into what and who had led them to the capital of Cambodia at a time when their homelands were cut off from the center and under communist control. Now, rather than narrating this little-known historic episode in detail, I would like to focus here on what an analysis of the conversion to Protestantism of these Bunong soldiers and their families might be able to tell us about their ways of perceiving and relating to the Cambodian central power and to the Khmer majority. To do so, let us go back to the Bunong couple's story. When my colleague Ned Brack and I asked them what led them to convert, they explained us that it was their family members who had stayed behind in the refugee camps in Vietnam, but who were speaking through them via cassette recorder. These family members apparently said that they themselves had entered Christianity and asked their relatives in Phnom Penh to follow because otherwise they could not anymore protect them. Thereby, they probably referred to their own inability to carry out the rituals required by the spirit gods to maintain good relations. In fact, when former Bunong refugees told me about their conversion in the Vietnamese camps, they explained that they turned to the Christian God because they found themselves unable to ritually purify the injuries that bombings and the burning of entire villages had inflicted on non-human agents such as rice and jars for whom they were responsible. In other words, the spirits were upset, but in the camps, most Bunong refugees lacked access to animals to sacrifice in order to appease them. One can thus imagine that when fellow Highlanders told them about a god who was stronger than all their spirits and had sacrificed his son to clean all human wrongs, this message resonated. What this also tells us is that the relations that appeared to have been determinant in the Bunong refugees' decision to convert were not so much those to other humans, but those to their spirits. Before we proceed, I would like to open a parenthesis on the usage of these conversion stories as historical sources. First of all, it seems important to underline the specificity of the Bounong's conversion stories compared to a form common among Western evangelical Protestants. Rather than narrations that lead up to a high point in which God or the Holy Ghost provokes a radical change of heart, the Bounong tended to depict their conversion as one episode within extensive war itineraries. I remember that at the beginning, when I asked people how they had come to be Christians, I was a bit perplexed when the answers started with a long list of places where they had taken refuge during their flight. Further, the way that my Bounong interlocutors explained how they entered Christianity was mostly very down to earth. Relating to this new God appeared to be an effective solution to the problems that people had been encountering in the context of war. I thus consider that these narrations can be approached like other oral history sources, that is, not as reflecting as a simple documentation of the past or an immutable essence, but as drawing on an evolving memory and constituting interpretative reconstructions that are not ideology transcendent. Let us now go back to the discrepancy between the description of conversion to Christianity as ethnic marker, possibly a state contesting one, and the Bounong convert stories that put spirit relations in the foreground. One could, of course, skeptically argue that Bounong's spirit-focused explanations just aimed at avoiding political problems, but considering that conversion needs to make sense in people's own terms and ways of being in the world, it appears very plausible that anxieties related to the impossibility of entertaining proper spirit relations in a context of ongoing violence constituted a major impulse for the Highland refugees to convert. If we now turn to those Bounong who agreed to return to Cambodia as part of the National Army and to their way of perceiving and relating to the Khmer majority, it must first be said that this very decision already indicates that connecting to these forces was not reprehensible for them. It appeared, in fact, in the course of oral history interviews, that many of those who enrolled had already been part of the army or of civil protection forces under the previous regime. This put them in particular danger of being eliminated by the Khmer Rouge and is thus likely to have contributed to their drive to join in the fight. When they found themselves in Phnom Penh, many of the Highland men were fighting in small Bounong brigades, but they were trained by Americans and some were in mixed units with Khmer, part of whom had also adopted Christianity. Moreover, the preachers who led the small group of Bounong converts were all Khmer. In fact, even if the main leaders of the short-lived Khmer Republic remained closely attached to Buddhism, the regime's close ties to the US government had led to an opening up to Christian, especially Protestant missions, and resulted in a relatively important number of conversions in a country known for its unreceptiveness to this religion. In this peculiar context that did not oppose Khmer versus ethnic minority groups, but people related to different political factions, and as well considering that the emphasis that many Bounong put on spiritual protection when recounting what had led to their conversion, one can wonder whether these Highland Christians perceived the fact of relating to the same God as some of their Khmer fellows as an important commonality. As the messages transmitted by cassette already indicated, among the Bounong, conversion was not an individual enterprise, but a collective decision that was minimally engaging people on a household level because it was impossible to stay under the same roof and be in relation with different and opposed gods. In the same way, one can suppose that from the point of view of the Bounong soldiers and their families, it would be valuable for a group of people fighting together to all relate to the same God. This association with one and the same God, however, did not lead Bunong Christians to perceive themselves to be on equal grounds with their fellow believers. Numerous of my interlocutors told me that Western Christians were most knowledgeable, notably because they were most closely related to Adam and Eve, and that people from the surrounding majorities also knew more than them because they had been learning from the Westerners for longer. Hence, the Bunong's way of describing how they gained access to this new religion did not question the state-promoted hierarchies, but it rather reflected them. Now, my example might be more compelling if sources were less scarce, but I hope that it still gives an idea of how looking at center-margin relations through the study of conversion can open up fresh perspectives on highland inhabitants' perceptions of the dominant majority at a certain point in time.
Thank you, Yves, Vanina, and Catherine, for your kind introduction and for your invitation to speak again at this seminar. I must say that I always feel very natural and very much a pleasure to be at the seminar. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is the dual focus on anthropology and history, which Vanina spoke about a moment ago. What I'd like to share this afternoon with respect to my own approach over quite a long period of time is, as a historian, the use of an anthropological approach, both in terms of the questions that anthropologists look at, but particularly useful for me over the past years is the ethnographic methodology, the use of interviews, sometimes also, as you can see in this picture, the question of material culture and what we can learn from that. And so I'm going to present a few insights into these questions from 4 different contexts in my research over recent years. 4 different contexts, which I've listed there on the slide. More recent research than my previous work, which Yves kindly mentioned at the beginning, Red Hills migrants, migration to the highlands in 20th century Vietnam, and its sequel From Montagnards to Ethnic Minorities, which I wrote with Matthew Guérin and 2 other colleagues, Nguyen Van Ching and Stan Tang. The first context is the Long Wall of Quang Ngai, which is research that I've been doing for more than 10 years now in the province of Quang Ngai in central Vietnam, and which you can see on the slide there, is located in that part of Vietnam where there used to be the civilization of Champa until the 15th century, and in some provinces more recently. There are no fine towers in Quang Ngai province, probably because they were destroyed in previous centuries. So those ones I know there are from the neighboring province, Bình Định. The Long Wall, 100 miles long, built of stone, dry stone walling for a large part of it, earth in other sections, and then reinforced with a bamboo, supposedly impenetrable bamboo, spiny bamboo hedge, and built in 1819. And one of the questions which we were forced to look at a few years after we started this research, we were originally thinking that this was a Vietnamese construction. It was a Vietnamese Great Wall of China. There was a Highlander group to the west, and the Vietnamese built this barrier to keep this Highlander group out and to set a boundary against them. We were forced to confront this question: who built the long wall of Quang Ngai. After we started doing ethnographic methodology interviews among the Highlanders. That was in 2009. I was very interested in the quote that Vanina mentioned earlier from Georges Condominas, where he was talking about the histories. Yes, they provide the framework for the dates of states and kingdoms and so forth, but not so much the people. Well, Kondo, he came to the Long Wall in 2008, and he said to me, he said, Andrew, if you don't go and talk to the Highlanders there, you are going to reproduce a state-based history of this war, which will reflect a Vietnamese perspective, but will not give both sides of the story. And of course, I heard him and I knew that was the case, but at that time we didn't have the authorization to go and do that research. We got that authorization in 2009, and within a matter of weeks after we started the multidisciplinary period of the project, you can see there the archaeological team to the right and bottom right and at the top left, but also the beginning of our interviews at the bottom left there. After we started doing this multidisciplinary work, we were confronted by the question of who built the Long Wall. In fact, it wasn't Highlander. The ethnic minority in this province is called the Hooray people. It wasn't a Hooray informant, as you can see here, who raised the question first, although many of them raised it later. It was in fact a Vietnamese, a King ethnic group interviewee who said, when I inadvertently asked him, do you know about that Vietnamese wall they built down there? And he said, that's not Vietnamese. That was built by the Highlanders. That was built by the Hooray. And so the question of who built the wall was placed in on our table, so to speak, and we spent a lot of time on that. It turned out, from a variety of different evidence, it turned out that this wall was built by both parties. It was built by both the King and the Hooray. It was a joint venture in a certain sense. Some of the evidence for that you can see here in the ethnographic field. The Hooray, even today, still use dry stone walling in many of their structures, not for their houses, which are traditionally made of bamboo, timber, thatch, etc. But other forms of building are still today using dry stone walling. And many of the narratives from many types of interviews. Once that question came out, of course, we then had another question to which only really an ethnographic approach would work. And indeed, the question itself is an anthropological question, which is about power. Because if this was a joint venture, we have to ask, well, the Vietnamese court were behind this. They were the mandarins of the Vietnamese bureaucracy were on the one side, but who were their interlocutors on the other side? Which political structure were they talking to among the Hooray? My knowledge of that at that time was, that Highlander politics was managed at the village level. And so in our first interviews, and you can see my colleague there, Bouté, we were asking relatively naive questions about, were there cantons, were there districts, what was the political structure among the Hooray in the French time and in the time before the French, the 19th century. No sign of canton, no sign of district. They all said no, village as well. But it turned out that in fact there were levels of village leaders. There were hierarchies of village leaders. Those hierarchies were set in contexts of buffalo sacrifices and the sort of feasting that took place after buffalo sacrifices. And so I was immediately placed back into this perspective of, it's a subject which anthropologists, as you mentioned earlier, have been looking at from Jacques Dorn's Potau and the theory of power to leech among the highlands of Myanmar. And so that question revealed a network, set of networks in the highlands, where perhaps 10 or 12 men, 1 or 2 women sometimes, would be the power holders in that region, and who would be able to control, more or less, the village heads in their section of the valley. And indeed, there's a 19th century text which actually names those men, a Vietnamese text from the 1860s, which says, if you want to go and work in the highlanders, you can speak to these men, and gives their names for each geographical area of the hills. Without the anthropological research, I would never have known how to interpret that list of names. But with the anthropological research now, of course, that list of names is such a precious document, because it's a kind of a proof that the ethnographic data applied to that period, as well as the slightly later period, the French early 20th century colonial period, that our ethnographic kind of memory reach was able to cover. And so all that gave us a lot of insights into the construction, the circumstances and the politics of the negotiation, but also the organization, the engineering construction of the Long War, and also helped us to understand that the Long War was part of the history of Vietnam's southward expansion, that in the 16th, 17th century, the Vietnamese migrated, and the Vietnamese state installed itself in this part of what used to be Champa, and that a population that used to be a population of Champa moved up into the highlands, and then as part of that set of relations, they built together, decided to build probably on the initiative of the Vietnamese court, but nonetheless a joint venture, this wall in the early 19th century. So that's a brief context number one, the Long Wall of Quang Ngai. Second context goes back in time a little further. This is a topic which I presented to the seminar last year, you may remember, on the subject of the Tay Son Rebellion, a major rebellion that took place in the late 18th century, which swept the Lê dynasty, Vietnamese ruling dynasty, from power. And at that time, Vietnam was divided into 2 kingdoms, the Nguyen lords in the south and the Chinh lords in the north. This rebellion swept them all away, and the Tay Son leaders established their own dynasty, short-lived, but nonetheless transformative. And what I wanted to do here was to look at the origins of this rebellion. In this plateau, you can see on the map there, to the western side of Bình Định province, you're in the plains of Bình Định, and the highland, that plateau marked in green there, is the An Khê plateau, it's called today. In those days, it was called Tay Son. I wanted to look at the local dynamics of that, because much has been made in Vietnamese and in English and French historiography of the rebellion itself, but there's very little known about the origins of it in this highland area. There are a few comments and very little historical material on that. So my method here was to try and look at the economics of it and try and see this in a highland, lowland relations perspective, and to see if that could teach us anything about the rebellion. And to do that, we decided to go and do some mapping and have a look at the roads here. And here is a photograph of us on the road at the edge of that plateau. Those mountains in the distance you can see are respectively a set of mountains, but also between them is a mountain pass going down to the plain, the coastal plain. And interviews with the local people you can see in the upper photograph to some extent. Interviews with them helped our cartographer Federico Barocco to draw this map a fascinating network of paths and trails that linked up the highland plateau with the lowlands, and along which trade has long passed. And there are 19th century sources that discuss that trade. We also confirmed the names and the existence of these paths with the local people when we went back to check whether that map was right. And it was lucky we did check that, because I got two of the names the wrong way around. I think the Bouté on the left should have been in the place where Bouté was on the right. I got that wrong around. They said, no, you got that one wrong. So another mistake avoided thanks to the ethnographic method. That in turn allowed us to draw this map, which is of the different trading networks, highland, lowland trading networks, where a set of different institutions here is linking the lowland area and the highland area. Each of those circles represents a set of networks, if you like. And the man at the origin of the Daesun rebellion, Wignac, he was a trader in this network. We now know how these networks worked. He was a trader, but those traders also were tax collectors. They also worked together with Highlander bandits who preyed on the trade itself. And in fact, what happened was that Wignac, he managed to place in his own hands all of these different roles: trader, taxman, bandit, and whatever. And in a context of weak central government, in fact, this was a rebellion which was able to quickly overturn the local institutions of power in Bingdi. He created his own fief in the hills. It took him 2 years to establish, and then he moved the rebellion off into the rest of the country. So in the end, this approach has given us a new view of the Daesun rebellion as a trader rebellion. And there you can see the Daesun army as depicted in one of the museums, the local museums to this event, coming down from the plateaus onto the plains to start the conquest. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll keep the next example a little. It's okay, a little shorter. Third context is the Sennheiser Revolt, which is back in Quang Ngai province to the north of where we were for the Daesun. An event took place in 1950, January 1950. It's a massacre by the Highlanders. Again, it's the Hooray people organized a terrible massacre of the Vietnamese, the King migrants who lived in their valley at that time. The Long Wall had been abandoned half a century earlier, and there'd been a process of migration with very peaceful and friendly relations between the two communities until 1950. This event probably not connected with the French Indochina War, although there was a close relationship with that war after the massacre took place. And I probably don't have time to go into the details of that. What I do want to show is how the ethnographic method, we worked for some years on this with interviews in the province, enriched our cartography of this event. The map I just showed you there was drawn from a map from the French military archives in Vincennes, and you can see the green shaded area. The cartographer deliberately took that green as a sort of to recall the green of the original map. It's a French army map. Here we're using archives, but that's the extent of the massacre through the district. But when we were in the place where the massacre started, which is a village or two villages, one on either side of that little stream to the south of that map of the event, you can see the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on that map, which which follow the progression from the early morning. Number 1 is at 6 a.m. in the morning, number 2 is 8 a.m., number 3 is more like 10, and 7 is about 3 in the afternoon. The progression of the large number of armed hooray men and the civilian population of king people, many women and children among them, who are retreating following those numbers, and who finally meet another hooray army coming upstream from the hooray, and so the riverbank is where the massacre actually takes place. As shown to us by the man you can see in the photograph there, who actually was kind enough to walk us around it. He was 13 or 14 years old at the time, and had very strong recall of that effect. And so without the ethnographic approach, we could never have done that cartography of this event. We also spoke to local politicians. This is a senior party leader of the time who was able to explain to us about how peace was restored to relations between those two ethnic communities. In the aftermath of the war, there was a policy of no revenge and no, once the Viet Minh had restored control of that, the map there is also the type of map which you can only get hold of if you go to the place. It's that's the map that's on the wall of the People's Committee of that commune, and so that's a very precious document in itself. And that is a photograph of the riverbank, which I mentioned earlier. The final context, very briefly, is in a slightly different part of the central region. It's further north in Ha Tinh province, and this was in also a different historical context. It's the early part of the French conquest of Vietnam. My interest in this was in a different form of intercommunal relation, and here we're dealing with what happened to the Catholics in this context, where the French have already taken the southern provinces of Vietnam, and there is growing disquiet, indeed opposition, to the Vietnamese court's policy towards the French, which was a form of negotiation among the literati. And there's the scholar gentry who organized in 1874 and then again in 1885 a series of massacres of the Catholic populations of their provinces. Massacres which are relatively underdocumented. They're really quite substantial numbers of people killed, particularly in the second one in 1885. But the document that I'm interested in here is from the earlier date, 1874. That's the last page of a letter at the archives of the Mission Étrangère de Paris, the Paris Missionary Society, where a French priest who was living in the village that's marked on the map there organized, unlike many of his colleagues in other villages, he organized some resistance to the army led by the scholar gentry against the Catholics. And during that resistance, the scholar gentry's army was repulsed. And there is a fascinating letter, because there's also an appearance of the Virgin Mary as part of the miracle of this event. Well, I decided that I wanted to go and have a look at this place, and I didn't have very much expectation of new data, but I wanted to look and see what the land looked like, what the rivers looked like, and just to get a sense of the place if I was going to write about it. I wanted to see what it looked like. And we were fortunate enough to be introduced to a local priest in a village nearby. And I made a terrible mistake, methodological mistake, which was asking an entirely direct, grossly direct question of this kind man. And I said to him, I said, have there been any problems and relations between the Catholics and the non-Catholics, the Buddhists in your area? Which afterwards I thought, why did you ask that question? That's you know, that's sort of what you guys learn at school, and which of course I didn't go to anthropology school. So anyway, mistake made. The answer turned out to be an excellent question, of course, because he said, yes, we did. He said there was a war years ago, and there was a battle. It was a terrible battle. But then there was a Virgin Mary appeared, and so the army of scholar gentry, and he repeated the same story that I'd read in the missionary's letter. And so there is a social memory of this event, which has persisted over the past 150 years. But that is not really what I learned from that interview. In fact, that was a confirmation of the information that missionary letters contained. What I learned from him was something that wasn't mentioned in the missionary's letter, but which was there. What I mean is this: is that he said one of the things which we also know is that many of those non-Catholic population, many of those villages of Buddhists, they helped us. They helped the Catholics. People hid Catholics in their houses, hiding them from that army of people who wanted to kill them. And so we've always been very grateful to our neighbours for that. And that's not something which the missionary, whose interest possibly was to maintain a black and white view of that. He's writing back to Paris. There's fundraising going on to rebuild the church communities, etc. But it is there in the letters, because he at one point reports an event where a mother and son are hiding in the house or in the barn of a Buddhist family. But then the owners of that barn bring the scholar gentry army to them and show them where they're hiding. And so this is brought up as a terrible example of perfidy, etc. But it's also proof that there was hiding of people going on. And I think what happened there was simply that this family were absolutely terrified when this army arrived, and they didn't, said, if you don't show where they're hiding, we'll do this, we'll do that. And so they showed them where they were. And so here we have an insight into the complexity of intercommunal relations and the way in which things are not always quite as they are perceived. And I think that's also something which would perhaps be more difficult to come out in a historical type of document, but which through this ethnographic research, we were able to put on record. I finished my 4 contexts, and so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So do we have any questions? No.
Not yet.
Not yet. So would you like to?
I have a question for Catherine, if I may.
Sure.
Which is, I found your presentation fascinating, and particularly with the kind of critique that you make of Saleming's idea of conversion to Protestantism as a form of protest. No, I was very interested by your critique of Oscar Saleming's idea of the conversion to Protestantism as a form of protest, and certainly from my own sense within the Highlander context that I've worked in Vietnam, it certainly seemed that is how the state would perceive that, and government officials in Vietnam often complain that the Protestants are less willing to comply with state policy. But going back to the post-war period, I wonder whether a way of looking at that would be, after the war, one would expect, and I think after previous periods of violence and destruction in the highlands, that would be what would have happened, would be that the Highlander societies would have rebuilt. And I saw the ways in which they were unable to rebuild in Vietnam during the research into Red Hills and that, in the context of migration. Suddenly, their land is occupied by very large numbers of migrants from the plains. There's a lot of forest destruction, probably more than during the war itself. And so the environment and the whole Highlander civilization, if you want to call it like that, suddenly actually becomes very difficult to imagine how it can be reconstructed. The conditions are not there. So I wonder whether that wasn't a sort of alternative way into that question, which I think that was how I was reading what you were presenting in a way. You gave some very interesting sort of perspectives on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I would like to say to Oscar Saleming's defense that this article I mentioned is a very, first of all, interesting reading again of all that has been written. And Nicolas Tapp was really the first one to promote this idea of protest, that then Oscar Saleming himself was relativizing in this paper. By saying that when he looked at different contexts, for instance, Philippines as well, and Singapore, of course, where Christianity has a very different place as well, he came to reconsider his reading. So that being said, yes, I think I definitely think that there's a close relationship between what is happening today, for instance, in Cambodia, where deforestation and land and migration are actually happening. What happened in Vietnam years back is now coming to Cambodia, and that's why I think reading what might have happened in Vietnam in the immediate post-war period through looking at Cambodia today might be a relevant way. And I do indeed observe people who say, well, we have not been able to protect our forests from corporations, from land loss, and now the spirits have no more place to stay. So there's a big question mark also partly about what spirits are up to, but what people do feel, at least this is coming out of recent interviews as well, they're not there anymore. They're not so much there anymore to support us. And again, also with more and more people becoming Christian, and that means less people doing ritual sacrifices and so on. That's another factor. It's like quote, Kenneth Dean, the spirits might be bored. I mean, if there's just a couple of rituals going on, that's defined as being problematic. So I do believe that there is a link there. Then I would also like to specify that a lot of conversions to Christianity and to a large part to Protestant Christianity has happened after the war in Vietnam. So nowadays, most of the Vietnamese Highland inhabitants are Christian Protestant. And there is an interesting fact that I didn't mention, but that would maybe go in this sense of also when you fight together, when you battle together, it is useful to be under kind of one common protective agent, is that those Highlanders who were fighting within the ethno-nationalist movement still after the war, continuing to fight the Vietnamese government, at the beginning they were not in majority Christian, and in the end they are the full row fighters have all mostly become Protestant, not even Catholic. So of course the full row leaders were Protestant, but Protestantism was minoritarian at full row's beginning. So it was during the years in the forests that they kind of turned all Christian. So I definitely believe that taking seriously the relation to these spirit gods is important, even if then, you know, the political argument that is put forth by the state, as you say, might at some point become, I don't know, I mean, it's not as if there was no point there, right? But that might be a later development and not an initial course for conversion. And a lot of Bunong interlocutors or Highland interlocutors are saying, the government says we are Christians with the Americans, but that's not the case. And I do believe that, as I said, that's not just an argument to kind of politically back out of the situation. Yeah.
Mm.
I hope that.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
No, but we have feel free to ask question. Any question are welcome, very welcome. Especially if you don't have any knowledge about Southeast Asia. It's perfect occasion.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll just go back to your Vanina's criticism of James Scott's thesis on the people fleeing the state. And well, first, I have to say that I think that The Art of Not Being Governed, well, it's a very stimulating book, and in a way, it gave a new impetus, I would say, to feminist studies on minorities and so on. So, and James Scott was very honest to say, well, I don't pretend that it works everywhere and so on, but just a sort of general idea. And I think it's interesting at first as a general idea. And well, actually, when you look at the work by Scott, he started by working on peasants' rebellion against kingdoms and so on. And so he was studying clashes between peasants and the state in a way. And with ethnic minorities, showing that they are fleeing, they are escaping, that they are trying to avoid any violent confrontation, any shock with the state. Well, actually, the problem is the definition of the state, which is one of the main problems, I think, in his thesis. And the second one, and as you said, as Vanina said, is that almost each time you try to go into details on a local situation, you see it doesn't work as Scott I think it worked actually, and that things are more complicated and people are not really fleeing and so on. And for instance, I can take the example of the Katu, where I did my field work, and so it's a very remote ethnic group, and actually they fled. Each time there was strangers, not just foreigners, but strangers coming. So when there was local conflicts, that other villages were coming on their territories, they would flee in the forests. The same, of course, with colonial army. But colonial army, usually it was garde indigènes. I mean, it was mostly sedent people or radés, aidés, and so on. And sometimes you had one colonial guy, at the head of that. But I mean, it was not really colonial power, with all this, and they were fleeing also. But they would have fled also if they were villages. They fled when they were Vietnamese or Laotian coming and so on. So it's kind of they would flee in the forest and come back immediately after, and rebuild their village if the village had been burnt and so on. And so at the same time, you can say, well, it's right. They are fleeing, but they're not fleeing the state because they have no idea of what is the state. And for instance, James Scott is quoting a lot, as you say, Clastres, but also Deleuze. And Deleuze, when well, used to follow teaching by Deleuze, so I remember well. And so Deleuze says that many people they never saw the state, they just see the very, very end of the state. and it's true that you are not the same conscious. You are not conscious in the same way when you see just one guy coming from time to time, because you know, at the colonial time, they were going, I know, once every 3 years, there was a column going to the islands with some tirailleurs, with some fighters, indigenous fighters, and so on. And then also 3 years later, they were totally forgotten. So, so I don't know, in your own context, first, do you think that the Scots thesis can apply in your context, or in your context, Catherine? And how would you define the state, actually? Because you know, this is a state with a big S, but there are many modes and many forms of states. So I don't know if you.
Thank you for opening the debate. No, I had a completely different remark to address Andrew and then Catherine, as it was about, I was so interesting about what you said, Andrew, about, okay, you can have old text and old scripts, but if you're an historian and you don't go to the field to inquire about what is about the text, you can do nothing with it. And actually, I'm currently working on manuscripts, which are royal edicts with a very political instruction to bring in taxes, to monitor the population, and so on. Of course, they are very rare, because most of the documents in the Thai area, I mean, in northern Burma, northern Thai, Laos, northern Vietnam, they're just about Buddhism or very religious order. So it's precious, but also maybe some of them have been written by my colleagues, historians, but they cannot do nothing with this because they don't know to which people, it was addressed, to whom, and in order to do what, and at what time. And so you miss one of the part of the regional history by if you don't do field work and cannot cross it with what the people have to tell about this.
I'm not sure that it's the case you can't do anything, but you certainly you are taking on an entirely new level when you do that. The landscape, the geography, and the people give you it's a different type of information, and so it gives you not only a different layer for you to analyze with that, but it also brings new insights back onto the historical information, and that's what I find always very stimulating about that type of view. And the last example of the priest there was fascinating, because apart from that one thing about the fact that the Buddhists were hiding the Catholics, the two stories were exactly the same. There was no difference except for the fact that one was I was reading in an archive, and the other I was hearing on the side, you know, in this man's house near the river.
And just to ask Catherine, it was also because what Yves just said about Scott, and I don't want to give the people the impression we reject Scott. At the contrary, it's very stimulating, and it traces together a lot of issues, and the writings and the writings among minorities regarding the population with what?
It's
Yes.
because I know that Catherine, you are using the term Zomia sometimes. No? Oh,
No.
Let us speak about the scripts.
No, I just wanted to react to Andrew's presentation and what you just said, Vanina, because I think, you know, when you said I wanted to see the place, I wanted to get a sense, you showed us many maps, this effort of grounding your sources and yeah, putting the geography that you put forth that we haven't had in the mix so far. I think that's extremely important, and it really does what you were saying, or what is sometimes missing, the fact if you don't know who are the people, where do they live, how can you even think about text meaningfully if you cannot ground it into space. So I can completely relate to, but I really do think that, I don't know, geographies of manuscripts, I don't know if such a thing exists, but I would consider that could be a potentially useful thing. And I was thinking about that in relation to topic that I haven't been exploring much yet, but that is taking quite a lot of mind space, which is this stone that's probably dated from the 10th century, because there's really not much in terms of, as you said, there's not much writing where we can find traces, and for Goudineau that's definitely very true. But there is this inscription in a stone that cannot be read apparently so far, and it's probably dated from the 10th century. And there are 10 of them, at least, that have been found in Cambodia quite along the Mekong River. So I think it would be interesting to, as a start, to do a map of them and then think about so far it cannot be understood what is written on them. I do hope that colleagues working on this can come up with something, but in the meantime, I guess that would be a way to start thinking about what these things could have been used for. I do hope that, is that an answer to your question? let's say so. And maybe just to get back to Yves' question about what is the state. Actually, preparing this talk, I was thinking that I was mixing the state and the Cambodian majority somehow, and of course they are related, but it's not the same thing. And I do think in the Cambodian context, and of course this is quite recently, the state has been very much embodied by King Sihanouk, Prince Sihanouk, who has been traveling through the country extensively, but that's of course very recent. But Sihanouk having had a talk that was strongly insisting on all the country's inhabitants being his children and Khmer, that did have, I believe, a very strong impact on people and on how they perceive themselves within the Cambodian nation, post-colonial nation state. But yeah, that's a very, very recent answer to your question. Too recent.
Actually, the result, Pierre Petit will be here, will be with us next week, I think, and he wrote he wrote a big introduction to a special issue journal with Holly, I think, about how to consider the state. And he says we should not take the state as an entity, but as a mode of relation, and to look at very local level what how it says some local offices supposed to be representative of the state can use official discourse, what is how do they interact with people and so on. So don't look the state as a big entity, at the back, everything, but to sit and to look at it in interactions at local level. And I think so. It's another way also to think about it. It can be interesting.
My answer to your question was precisely going to offer an example of that, which is from the MK Plateau, the place where the Daesan Rebellion started, and where you can see, you'll be familiar with this, Yves, from your reading of Tourispur. There was a Bana leader there who the Vietnamese state, in the form of some scholar gentry or maybe some Vietnamese soldier or officer of some sort in the 19th century, gave this Bana leader, Mok Kiem, a diploma. They would have given him also a tunic, some clothes of ceremonial value to him. And this Highlander village leader would have used this alliance with the Vietnamese state and these paraphernalia that proved that alliance to build his own set of networks, his own power base among the other villages, to saying, I'm the guy who is allied to those people who bring the trade and who also bring other forms of state relationship. And here we have a case of a Highlander who's not fleeing the state, but who's actually seeking to ally himself with the Vietnamese state. who then also allies himself with missionaries when they're the ones who report about this in the mid-19th century. And all of that as Ang Ming's research, Dang Ming's been doing research on that. All that is because he's in an uncomfortable context as a Banar whose ethnic group has lost land to the Jarai. The Jarai have taken some of their land. And so these state alliances with the state are part of a rivalry with a neighboring ethnic group on the highlands. And here we are, grateful to her perspective for actually bringing in that pre-colonial perspective that from the 1820s or so, that there is a sort of there's stuff going on the highlands which passes under the historical radar.
So I think we have a question. No.
We have to conclude.
No.
Before concluding, because you talk about Pierre Petit, I would like to repeat how lucky we are to get this visiting professor program at the EHESS, because we talk about 3 colleagues, Jean-Michel, Jonathan Padoui, and Pierre Petit, and the 3 of them are coming to join us in the seminar, and because of this program, and which is a very great opportunity to make people from very different countries to meet and work together in this event.
Okay, so, well, I think that I'll make an end to this session. Thank you very much, 3 of you. And just I would like to maybe remind you, people listening, that so next week, on Monday, the 28th, March 28th, we will have Camille Schmoll, Aurélie Varel et Hélène Thiollet. We'll speak about les migrants et la ville, une perspective comparative, so migrants and the city, a comparative perspective. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for following.